Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are on Trainer Hill because we are going to be doing an adjusted tier list for the World Championships. Now, we have already done one in this Paldea Evolved meta. We did it before we had the NAIC and really as we were still testing out a lot of the decks. So it feels like we have a better picture now, and we have seen a big shift in the metagame, not just from the results of the NAIC, but also in a lot of the online results. It seems to be a real shift for a few of these decks based on, partly the successes and the falls from grace from the NAIC. So Jack, do you want to get straight into it?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to kick things off with the winning NAIC deck, Inteleon Urshifu. This is a deck that obviously it won the whole event, I think, to a lot of people's surprise, but it was really great to see Cyrus piloting it so well. We're going to pop it in that B tier. Realistically, I think this is actually a great deck, and me and Joe were doing some testing with the deck this weekend, and I think whilst neither of us really doubted its power, we were both pretty surprised as to just how strong it could be in certain situations, which was really good. It really liked to it really likes a lot of the top matchups. I think the natural tend or the natural changes that have gone on in the format have led to it actually maybe even being in a little bit of a better position in some ways for Worlds than it was for NAIC, and evidently it was doing well at NAIC. But I think there are still some inherent issues here and there. And I think for exactly day one of Worlds, there's also some things that may be holding it back. The rise of more Lost Box decks is always going to be good for it because it absolutely farms those. Arceus decks, we saw it obviously play and beat Arceus decks throughout NAIC, including the finals. And Gardevoir, again, lots of small basics and stuff. You're a little bit more scared to pop down things like Urshifu and stuff just because they tend to get blown up, but typically the amount of pressure you can put on some of these evolving basics with the Inteleons and Radiant Alakazam and all this kind of stuff is just too much pressure for evolving decks. Single Strike Lugia, Fusion Mew were typically the deck's harder matchups, and you'll see that we're not actually going to be putting these in the A tier, so that's good, but these are both decks that are we feel going to be quite popular in day one just because ties are a trap in day one of Worlds, and Single Strike Lugia and Fusion Mew are two decks that will very often just get games done. Whether it's wins or losses, they're going to be getting games done. You're not going to be falling into the tie trap, which is really important for trying to get through the first day of Worlds. And because of that, I think that's actually the biggest thing that's holding Inteleon Urshifu back from being maybe creeping into that A tier. I think it is pretty happy with a lot of the matchups up at the top, but I think the meta is going to be a little bit worse for it on day one. On day two, I actually think it could be a really strong pick because I think people are going to be a little bit more brave. Ties are a little bit less punishing on day two as well. So I think it's actually maybe one of these decks that might be a little bit better placed for a day two player or someone that's grinded in from day one. But I think for that day one metagame, that's what's going to hold it back. And things like some of these faster paced decks are actually going to be ones that are just matchups you're not really wanting to see, and they're going to be a bit more popular because people don't want to be tying games. So yeah, really, really strong deck. And again, I was surprised is the wrong word in terms of like how good it is, but I was it was really cool to see sort of the intricacies of the deck when me and Joe were testing it at the weekend, and it felt like for some of these top decks it was a very, very difficult matchup, and there was a lot going on, and a lot could spiral out of control quite quickly just because you can take multiple prize turns and there's so many damage counters flying around. So it's definitely one to respect, and I think again you'll be able to get games done quite quickly with the deck as well because you just have these big turns that you're able to take multiple prizes on and go quite quickly, and it's not really this massive setup deck that some Urshifu decks have been in the past where you're doing all of the shady dealing and stuff. No, now it actually can be quite aggressive with the amount of Inteleons and stuff you can get out. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting one. I think there's definitely ways for some of these top decks to play around it, and I think it's scared of a couple of the B tier matchups, but I think if you're a day two player, it actually should be a very strong consideration, and maybe a little bit higher, maybe even the bottom of A, top of B when it comes to it for day two, but a little bit lower just for day one to avoid some of these awkward matchups that people are going to naturally favor towards.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I actually agree that it's definitely a better day two play, I think, than day one for exactly as you mentioned, tying, making, or sort of influencing the deck choice of players a lot more for the World Championships. Let's jump on to, I guess, the deck it beat in the finals then, Arcdura. Seems like every time we're underestimating this archetype, I thought it was going to be Iono that was the death of this deck, but it seems to have kept in the mix. We're going to put it in tier 2. It does ask a lot of questions of, again, some of the high tier decks in the game. Represents great type coverage, as we know, into Gardevoir and Mew. Has Starbirth to fall back on. Has Duraludon just for being a very meaty and awkward Pokemon. Can tech in some tool cards as well to help out a few matchups here and there. There are even Arc mirror techs coming into the deck with extra damage mods and even things like Karen's Conviction. So that's also an intriguing thing to improve your time into other Arc matchups, which is kind of cool. So yeah, I think the deck's very easy to pilot. Knows when it's ahead and when it's behind. It's quite obvious on turns 1 and 2, so you can scoop quite quickly with this deck. You'll certainly get 3 games in, and we know that the list from the NAIC is very strong, an easy copy-paste, and it's going to still be a presence. I think the reason why we're still not putting it into that higher echelon is that it seems to be disadvantageous against Arctina, usually because they are dictating the amount of Judge and Path in the mix early, and they have their own fallback draw engine from Bibarel. So if it does become this weird mudslinging contest where neither of you can Starbirth, typically they get out of that mess a little bit before you do. And also, the Lost Zone Giratina deck has really risen to popularity that we'll touch on in a moment, and that's a big challenge, a big foil to Arcdura, which was hoping to be a tanking deck in the game. That's its whole MO, is being too big for many of these other decks in the format. And yeah, essentially Lost Zone Giratina laughs at that and completely annihilates the board quite quickly. So that's also a big concern for the deck, I think.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Gardevoir. Gardevoir, I think, was people's #1 deck for Paldea Evolved. It's still in that A tier. I still think it's very, very solid. Obviously, it didn't win NAIC, but it still had a massive showing, both in representation and in final placement. So still a very, very solid deck. Again, starting to get concerned about more and more of these Lost Box variants, as it always has been. That includes Giratina, whilst you do have 2 prizes here and there that you want. They have 2 prizes that you can pick up on. They're still at the heart of things. A deck that can get to Sableye quite quickly. In fact, sometimes as quick as Lost Zone Tina, as the Turbo Lost Boxes because of Abyss Seeking. So they're happy to sack off a couple of early prizes and then get into Sableye really quickly and just start crumbling your board. So it is a little bit worried about that, but I think there's no doubt about the fact that this deck has the highest ceiling in terms of just how good the deck is, I think, overall. I think no one's really surprised by that. I think the biggest debate around this deck is actually how you build it. There's a couple of trains of thought around whether you're playing just a heavy, good support account, is kind of what Joe and I have coined it, just playing the good supporters in a relatively high count and getting into the game and letting the Guardies kind of do the rest of the work. Whether you're sort of how you're playing your stadium split, whether you're playing 3 stadiums, whether you're playing Worker, whether you're playing which stadiums you're playing. There's a lot of twos and fro's with things like that. I think personally, I'm still a big fan of Champions Festival, and I'm still respecting Path enough in things like Lost Zone Tina and also some of these Arc decks that I would probably be playing Worker as well and Powpad and that kind of combo, which does eat into maybe some of your other supporters or some of your other tech cards, things like Forest Seal Stone or Sky Seal Stone, things like that. But I think the most important thing is just going to be playing the game. I'm still a massive fan of this deck, and I'm still a big believer in its sort of raw power. And I think a lot of the time that's just what you've got to lean into for Worlds. It's very rare that you'll see these sort of crazy decks or overly teched decks do massively well. I think for a tournament like Worlds, you just want realistically the best raw 60, because that a lot of the time that's just going to be the best cards to be playing rather than trying to do something cute or something techie. So for me, things like the Champions Festival, whilst they might seem a little bit techie, I think they're going to be really important to dealing with some of these multi-prize matchups, as well as just respecting other people's path to the peak. I still think the deck is very, very powerful, and whilst it may not be it may not be so far ahead of other decks than we first thought. I don't think we're going to see 25% meta share like we did at EUIC or NAIC, sorry, and anything like that. I still think it's going to be very popular. I still think there's a lot of people that really enjoy playing the deck. I know I do. I know Joe does. It's a great deck to play. It's really fun. And I still think it's probably, if you split out the Lost Zone variants, probably going to be the most popular lone archetype on day 1. And maybe even day 2 as well. So yeah, definitely one that you need to respect and keep in mind, and still, I think one of the most powerful decks in the format. Definitely, probably the most powerful in terms of the ceiling it has. I just think there are a couple of counters here and there, or a couple of headaches here and there from things, primarily Sableye, but also things like Path of the Peak and stuff in decks that do keep it in check just a little bit more than maybe they did in for the NAIC format.
Makes sense to me. On to, I think I want to talk about Lost Zone Giratina, because this really is like the talking point going around right now in online tournaments, and obviously didn't have a great showing at the NAIC. It did get some top 64 placements, but none in top 32, and it still seems to be gaining popularity. The metagame has shifted, well, at least people are thinking that it shifted enough towards Arc decks in general that it's worth having higher damage output in your Lost Zone variant, so you can play that mix and match between having a big beat stick and playing with your single prizes and getting creative with that prize map. We're putting it as the best deck in the game right now. Its online data is heavily reinforcing this, and I know I've been testing it a ton, and Jack's been testing it a ton for Worlds ourselves. So it has been in our limelight for over a month now, and I still can't really put the deck down. It plays on so many different angles where you can be aggressive with your ramping of the Lost Zone to open up Mirage Gate for some big power spike plays for multi-prize knockouts or Greninja threat. Even getting to that Sableye quickly is always handy. You have paths at your disposal, which can sometimes just be cheesy against the Arc decks, cheesy against Mew, cheesy against Lugia. It's a constant headache for the Gardevoir players to throw paths into the mix. And you have hand disruption as well, so it pretty much ticks every box. It's a very well-rounded deck. It's taken a while for us to get here, but it seems like Quad Jet Energy, it's finding its way, and as you know, enough people have tried out the deck now, and there's been enough time ironing out a list that Giratina seems to be very powerful. And at least from the matchup data that we're seeing from the online results, it looks like there is no conceivable negative matchup that's worse than like 45%. So that's insanely powerful for the deck. Everyone has taken note, and it's the real talking point of discussion. How many people are actually going to show up at Giratina, I don't really know, but it looks like it seems to be very popular in the online tournament spaces. It's becoming the most popular deck, the most played deck right now. And that's a surprise to me, seeing as though how much resistance there's been over the last few tournaments in person. But it feels like people have had their chance to test out with the deck and seemingly are quite happy with the results. So, yeah, I believe this isn't quite going to be the most popular deck in the room, but I do think it could easily end up being in that top 3 of popularity going into Worlds. So definitely get your testing in against Lost Zone Giratina, because it seems to have finally sort of re-entered the format.
Yeah, I think just for... obviously, we've kind of raved about the deck. The only thing that's holding it back, I think, in our eyes from that S tier is there hasn't been a huge tournament with it. There's been lots of... there's been the Asia Open, and there's been a lot of sort of 100-plus player online tournaments, but obviously live is very different. It's often best of one and that kind of stuff. So I think had it had even like a top 8 or 2 at a big tournament, as well as still being very popular, it would definitely be in that S tier for us. But we're just waiting to see how it performs in an IRL metagame. But I think there is every reason to believe that if we were to do this a couple of weeks after Worlds, Giratina could be in that S tier. It just feels absolutely absurd. A couple of decks that don't like Giratina. The couple I'm going to talk about are Arceus, Regidrago, and Goodra Lost Zone Box. They're a couple of decks that are a little bit more fringe. We're going to put them in the D tier, just because I think primarily these were decks that weren't massively on people's radar anyway. Arceus, Regidrago did very well in the juniors division, obviously, as well as being popular here and there in the seniors and masters division with a couple of players. Again, it's an Arceus deck, but it's an Arceus deck that has a lot of additional things, a lot of additional attackers, a lot of things that you have to add into the list to make it work. And we've seen with Arctina and Arc Duraludon that the simple, like something as simple as missing energy plus Arceus turn 1 can completely derail your game plan. And that's way more likely to happen if you've got in an Arceus Regidrago deck whilst you're running quite a lot of energy. There's so much more you have to add into your deck to keep going. You've got all the Curlier and Rolt stuff, which admittedly are consistency cards, but they're not early consistency cards, so they're just kind of clunky there. You've then got to find the right attackers here and there. It's one of these decks that I think it's just a worse Arceus deck overall. Arceus Giratina is better at doing the aggressive stuff. Arceus Duraludon is better at doing the defensive stuff. So yeah, it's a difficult one there. And again, these defensive decks that are in the format really don't like Tina being popular because they at least get one turn of just wiping out whatever's in the active, but then they also have a naturally very high damage output anyway to be able to just start churning through once they've used their sort of big blow up attack. So yeah, similarly, Gudra and Giratina are very much two sides of sort of a similar coin. When one does well, the other does really, really badly because the defensive one, or the defensive building Gudra, again, just really doesn't like Lossone Giratina being anywhere near as popular as it was. I think Lossone Tina was considerably smaller, or considerably worse, or considerably lower in popularity for EOIC, which is when Gudra was doing well. But now that Lossone Tina is such a known archetype, or such a popular archetype, Gudra is just considerably worse. I think you're also just a worse Lossone deck than Lost Box and Lost Tina because both of them can ramp up to 10 way quicker than you can. So you're losing on the defensive front because Giratina can just blow you up, and you're losing on the Lost Box front because their Sableyes are going to get to 10 before you are. So yeah, unfortunate for Gudra and Regidrago players, but we wanted to make note of them just because they often see sort of fringe popularity, but unfortunately it's not quite the meta for them.
All right, I'm going to touch on Lugia. It did manage a top 8 at the NAIC, so it didn't exactly underperform, but it wasn't really that popular throughout those higher echelons. I think there was only one other in top 32, so it kind of underperformed at the NAIC. I think it's not necessarily do a comeback, but it's certainly among the top decks still and should not be under-respected because there's that very easy rock, paper, scissors mentality of thinking that many good players will gravitate to Gardevoir, therefore there's a temptation to play Giratina or Lossone Box, and one of the best foils to both of those is Single Strike Lugia, actually, because it can represent some really annoying high hit point multi-prizes and high hit point single prize Pokemon. So the value of Cram and Sableye really do diminish, and immediately just being able to deal with these Lost Zone engines, especially as it seems like there's a bigger gravitation towards Turbo than there is Kyogre at the moment. Single Strike Lugia is really reaping those rewards, and I do think it's under-respected how decent its meta placement actually is in the game. It can still handle the Arc decks fairly comfortably. Yes, Duraludon is a concern, but I believe that it's still going to not be too popular because of the Giratina threat right now. I feel like it's more likely that the most popular Arc variant will be Arctina, and that really becomes a question of whether or not you can withstand some early judge and path combinations. And if you can, you're going to have a really good time. Even if you just go first into these Arc matchups, I think you're really well prepared. You can already summon before they can even have a response into you. And, you know, sometimes it's just going to run away with the prize race. Another huge selling point for Lugia is that it is so quick and easy to get its games done. Again, if you're not summoning on turn 2, if your Lugia's getting knocked out, you can quite easily pick up your cards and know full well that you have a healthy 45 minutes on the clock to turn it all around with 2 games, and you'll get that done because you have the high-hitting presence, and even when you are into single prize matchups, your actions are very quick. You certainly shuffle the deck each turn, but you basically have no other actions after that. So yeah, you get your games done fast. It seems well-placed. It's still punishing Gardevoir at times with its Dark-type coverage. It's punishing the Arc decks with Fighting-type coverage. And it's one of the better foils to Lost Zone. So it's still really well placed, and I think is a genuine threat in the metagame. It's just not quite making it into that A tier because it does have inconsistencies, and that is somewhat highlighted by Spiritomb. I think that easily could have been a contributing factor as to why we saw so few Lugias in the very high echelons throughout day 2 of the NAIC. It's because you do lose some consistency percentage points just by people throwing in that tech card, and there's still a reasonable chance that there'll be a number of Arcs playing the Tomb. There's a reasonable chance some Gardevoir still play the card as well, so Spiritomb's still going to be around, and that is a minor flaw for Single Strike Lugia. Maybe it will make some players adapt their lists and even start adding in Squawk. We have started to see that in online data, so definitely something worth considering.
Yeah. Speaking of Spiritomb, I guess I'll touch on Fusion Mew, which is going to round out our B tier. Fusion Mew is a really interesting one. Again, it's kind of its success is not necessarily dictated by the popularity of Mew, but definitely it's a big contributing factor. Fusion Mew is still, in our eyes, the best way to play it because DT Mew feels like it really doesn't have an answer to Spiritomb, whereas at least you do have options. And whilst they force you to draw those options, at least you are in the game. Whereas against Fusion Mew, with DT Mew against any Spiritombs, you really do have to pretty much draw the absolute nuts to try and stay in the game. So we still think Fusion Mew is definitely the way to go. It's still a super aggressive deck. I actually still really enjoy playing the deck. I've always preferred the more aggressive style of Mew, but it's still got those defensive tools for the late game, and I think that's why Mew still sits in that B tier, because it still can win out games by being overly aggressive and getting really early pressure on the board with either Meloetta or Ice Cube, and in combination with things like Lost City and stuff, as well as the Alistair Sparkle. It can also steal games with things like Iono or Judge plus Path in the late game. It's just those games that where you're not able to really apply that pressure, or your opponent's playing a deck that isn't necessarily as influenced by Path Iono. Those are the kinds of games that are going to sometimes get a little bit out of control, along with, again, just this constant question mark of how much will people be respecting you, how much will people be playing Spiritomb, especially as Joe just said, that it's not just a one deck counter, it has sort of additional uses here and there against various other decks. So yeah, I still think there's a lot to this. Again, it's another deck that's going to be, for day one, drawing a lot of cards, getting games done quite quickly. You're not going to be too worried about these ties. Even when you're a deck that can randomly cheese games with Path Iono in the late game, you're still going to be getting there very quickly. So you're very rarely sort of baited into a long game with Mew to then lose. A lot of the time, you're able to pull off this 1 or 2 card Iono Path combo and just try and close out the game from there. And it's not taking massive time. So I think it's still an appealing day one play. I think the question mark over the Spiritomb count is annoying. And I think Giratina's presence is also a little bit worrying, because whilst, again, you're able to still be quite aggressive, they're able to trade up into your VMAX and then use their 1 prizes to trade into your 2 prizes. And now that you're playing the 1 prizes again, they're able to do the 1-2-3 plan, which was often the way these Lost Zone decks liked to deal with you. They wanted to go 1-2-3 into a 1, 2, and 3 prizer and not have to go through multiple VMAXs. So that doesn't really have to happen anymore. Now Fusion is the popular build. So I think that's the biggest concern. Typically, whilst sort of things like Sky Sealed Stone were popular in Gardevoir, I think a lot of players have moved away from that, and I think there's still going to be an element of people playing it, but it's weird. There's actually, like I said when talking about Gardevoir, there's so many different mindsets on like the last 5 cards in Gardevoir that I don't think it's going to be massively popular. So I think that's a bit of a better matchup for you, especially with things like Ice Cube plus Lost City now as well. And some people just won't want to play Spiritomb, so the Ice Cube and Lost City combo actually ends up taking out things like Rolts and Curliers, which is way more impactful and really does close out the game. So yeah, definitely a good one for day one. Again, I think in a similar way to the Single Strike Lugia, it's just going to get games done and get them done quickly, which is important. But I think there's a couple of tripping hazards here and there with some of the Lost Box decks that can cause issues, as well as just randomly losing to other people's paths and stuff in the early game if you're not able to find your bounces in some of these other heavier path decks.
Nice one. I'm going to talk about Lost Box. We're going to keep this in our top 3. It's still one of the better challenges to Gardevoir. I think that's still pretty evident. It can still run away with games with just early tempo, Mirage Gate on turn 1. If you have that high roll going second, it's still very dangerous at that, into the Arc matchups, into the Lugia matchups. So you still can represent favourable prize trades just from that early emphasis alone from the Dragonite. The Giratina matchup's an interesting one. You will probably play the aggressor, so it's how you sort of handle your situations against Roxanne and sometimes Iono if they're playing it as well. But typically you'll be the one getting to 10 faster, and you have to try and weave in your Raikou and be extremely careful and cautious about when you weave in your Dragonite, because of course you damage your own bench in doing that, and it allows the Tina player actually to pivot into their Sableye strategy, which is quite dangerous. So yeah, it still seems to be a very powerful archetype. Its speed is probably one of the only factors that makes me worry about the deck as a day one choice. You have to be very adept with Lost Zone if you feel like you can play it quickly enough to avoid those ties. That's probably one of the only issues with the archetype. And there's the small concern of Arcdura still being a deck in the format, because that also proves to be quite difficult where you are running out of damage output at times. We are seeing things like Starmie V potentially as a tech card inclusion. Not sure how much I love it, but it seems reasonable just to give yourself an extra V attacking Mon into those, Arcdura and Arctina, and even it helps out against Lugia sometimes as well. So not a terrible inclusion right now. So might be some food for thought for Lost Box, because anytime you can sort of just speed up your deck and have a 2-for-2 prize trade, that's actually not the worst thing for you. Maybe it makes you a little bit less stable against Iono, but just accelerating that win condition, accelerating the amount of turns required to win the game, could be a great way for you to still win in time. But yeah, certainly still a very consistent, powerful performer that still boasts one of the better matchups into Gardevoir, which is still a massive selling point, I think.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Lost Box Charizard, a deck that Joe and I are both massive fans of, that's sort of fallen away from popularity. We're going to pop it in that C tier. This has got a little bit more popular recently, primarily because of the success of Giratina. I think it's one of the best counters into Lost Box Tina, because you essentially have a Giratina VSTAR in Charizard, except it's a one prizer and you're able to recycle it, which is obviously very, very good. You still have the Sableye stuff against Gardevoir, but again, things like Iono and stuff are a little bit more annoying against this type of build. And some of these other sort of some of these other decks, things like Urshifu, Inteleon, and things like that, have never been particularly you've never been particularly happy about seeing them. I think it naturally is probably the least consistent of all of the Lost Zone builds at getting to 10, because you don't have the Tina to get there, or you don't have the turbo stuff to get there. So against other Lost Boxes, that's the biggest issue. You're not able to get to 10 as quick as they are, so they'll often just be the aggressor, similarly to how they are against Tina, but then they'll continue to be the aggressor. They'll get there, and then they'll just stay ahead of you and just start Sableying you way quicker. So I think it's definitely a bit of a riskier play, but I think it's one that definitely can have benefits if you're really expecting a high amount of Tina. I still think there's benefits in some of the other multi-prize matchups, but I think the biggest worry is just the amount of Iono. Being able to chain Charizard is a lot harder when your hand is disappearing every turn. Yes, it's had to deal with things like Roxanne and stuff in the past, but it's typically been able to filter the deck down to something quite thin, whereas now you're constantly having to sort of fight an uphill battle with your hand getting reset way more frequently. So yeah, it's definitely one that's, I think, going to be a little bit of a riskier play, and I think that in combination with it just being a worst pure Lost Box deck is going to keep it down in that C tier. But yeah, it can really trade well into Giratina, and it's always kind of had an okay matchup in some of the other multi-prize matchups, just because that's exactly what Charizard likes to do. So definitely a bit of a riskier one. I think it's another one that's also a little bit concerned about time. All of these Lost Box decks never really like the 50-minute time limit, so one to keep in mind. But I think there's maybe there's at least reason to discuss this archetype again now that Giratina is so successful.
For sure. One of the decks that may have flown under the radar a little bit from the NAIC, but did manage a top 32 placement, was a sort of Chien-Pao Palkia that had no Baxcalibur. So it was actually mostly a Palkia deck, and utilized Chien-Pao just to fish water energy out for you in the opening stages, and then became like a pretty nice self-sustaining engine where you fish out the water energy, you start using your Radiant Greninja, and that helps you build your board state. And we're going to put this towards the high end of C tier. I actually put a good amount of time into this deck, probably a couple of weeks, and I feel like it's really solid, to be fair. It has a lot of the same strengths as the Arcdura and the Mew, in that it plays that Lost City to sort of integrate a win condition into the deck against the Lost Zone players and against the Gardevoir players by having this cornerstone of consistency, just getting a turn 2 Palkia attack with the Irida engine and with backup, Greninja draw and Bibarel draw. Super easy to do. And you also threaten, of course, turn 2 Greninja as well. So the Palkia Bibarel is a really good going first aggressive deck. It puts pressure on a lot of different things, can boast Lost City, and has inherent Iono protection. So rather than having the disruptive element of Path Judge that like an Arc Tina does, this is more sort of mid-range in its damage output in a similar way, but rather than going for the hand disruption, hope you brick game plan, it's just I'm going to lost city away key pieces of the board and hope that that's disruptive in a completely different sense, whilst also having a pretty solid single prize attacking threat at its disposal. You can try and play that Starmie V again. I don't know how it's come up twice in this video, but it has. But it can help out against some Arc matchups for some higher damage outputs. You obviously are playing your Melanies in there as well to support the Palkia, so that you can maintain that steady flow of energy, even if you are committing your VSTAR power to a Chien-Pao or to a Greninja, because that's where your little bit of burst potential really comes from in the deck, where you can reach some higher damage output thresholds. Not very commonly, but once or twice in the game, which can be really handy when you're talking about things like the Lugia matchup and stuff. So yeah, I think the deck is very consistent, very low to the ground, works and gets into most games, and actually has some flexible surprises up its sleeve as well, with some V attackers that it could be splashing in. So I am genuinely quite fond of the Palkia Bibarel. It actually did well last Worlds. That's how long these cards have been around for. But I feel like if someone's ironed out that list a little bit more, I've actually tried builds with no Chien-Pao whatsoever and taken out a lot of the switching cards and just have a higher physical water energy count. That also seems really reasonable, where you just play very thick Palkia and Bibarel, and even try Squova in there as well. I did for a little bit of time, just to have that same cycle that you experience with the Arctina, because just in general, being an Iono-proof, kind of consistent aggressive deck is just good in the game right now. So I am low-key flying that Palkia flag, even though it's probably not a deck that I'm going to risk taking to Worlds. I certainly respect it, and anyone who also caught their eye at the NEIC and have been testing it, I'm right behind you. I think it's got a chance at Worlds.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think it's the deck that is probably going to have the most surprising success, I think, is where I would put it at. Because I think people just haven't... anyone that's ironed out this list, like you say, and actually put time into this, I really do think there's something there. I just think it's for... it's for people that have been able to do it, and we've sort of not got to a list that we're super happy with taking to Worlds. But yeah, I think the archetype is really, really under the radar right now, and very, very appealing. Speaking of, you just mentioned Arctina, I'm going to round out our top tier, our A tier, with Arctina. To no one's surprise, really, I think this has kind of been the best Arc deck in a lot of people's opinion for a little while. Whilst it didn't do as well as Duraludon in terms of placements, it's still really, really strong. It outperforms in various different ways some of the other Arc decks, as well as a lot of these other decks, simply because it's able to control the pace of play with Judge plus Path, whilst also having the backup of really being able to just close out games very quickly with the super high damage output of Arceus. Of Giratina, and the consistency of Arceus. So the biggest issue, I think, with the deck is that those random games where you won't get a turn one Arceus plus attach, and yes, you're still able to do things like Trinity Charge on the following turn, but that means you're generally then giving up Starburst, which is obviously then leads to a whole world of problems. So I think the biggest issue is just you're very, very dependent on the first turn or two of the game. I think once you get into the game, a lot of the time, Arceus Giratina will see it through. Once it gets energy, once it gets to attaching energy and it's got its barrels down and things like that, I think there's a very, very solid chance that it can pretty much win the majority of these matchups. It's just so front-loaded on these first two turns and getting them right. And that's, I think, the biggest issue with the deck. I think it has game plan, or it has a very similar game plan into every matchup, which is really important for a tournament like Worlds. And again, out of the top 4 decks out in our A tier, this is the deck that I would be taking in our A tier if you're really worried about getting your games done and not going to time, because again, it's another deck where you very quickly know whether you're in the game or whether you're, more importantly, whether you're not, and whether you can happily wrap things up and go for trying to win 2 games in 40 minutes. So yeah, I think the 3 decks above it definitely have more room for more wiggle room and are probably a higher power level, but they come at a cost of more decisions and therefore taking more time and more actions and this, that, and the other. And I think that's really where Arceus Giratina does shine in terms of a pick for Worlds. It's one of these decks that has the power level of some of the other top tier decks, but requires way less decision making, and therefore you're way less worried about falling into this tying trap. So yeah, very, very strong archetype. I think it's got the aggressive and the defensive side to it, and honestly, yeah, really expect this to be quite a popular deck and to do quite well overall.
One that I'm a bit less hot on, and that's Chien-Pao Baxcalibur. Did fairly well at the NAIC, to be honest. A few breakout performances. No top 8s, but still a top 16 placement and another in the top 32. Its online data is atrocious, though. If you're following the trends, Chien-Pao Baxcalibur is essentially a joke of a deck, in that it has a number of 30 and 40% matchups, with basically 0 above 50%, which is probably a slight on the deck, but also kind of proves to me that there's been no definitive ironed out list. I feel like there isn't a list, this sort of magical list that wraps everything together where it's consistent enough but has enough, aggression, whilst also having the disruption elements of like the Lost City or the cancelling Cologne plays that you want available to you. I just don't think that package of cards exists in 60 cards, to be honest with you, because you're still trying to juggle a stage 2, you're still throwing in stage 1s, be it the Palk or the Arc, and there are times where you're just still going to crumb to Judge Path, certainly, from Mew or from Arctina. And I think that's just awkward. I think you can just end up with too many awkward hands of the deck. I really don't think it can go that far. The biggest upsides of Chien-Pao is that it's super aggressive, gets on the board quickly, and low-key, it actually prefers seeing more Tina in the format than, like, other things, I suppose. Like, any Lost Zone Giratina percentage is a small benefit to Chien-Pao, because especially there are a number of cross-switcher Tinas that are dropping mana fee, and I know Stefan Ivanov's done a list from a cup that he played at that also played no mana fee. So if there are mana fee-less Tinas, it's actually quite nice for Chien-Pao because you can limit their bench quite quickly. And they are then left with just a multi-prize board state. So you can actually end up going 2-2-2 with a Greninja attack and a couple Chien-Paos. So yeah, if you have that robust Bibarrel option, you can see yourself through the hand disruptors. And to be honest, a lot of decks are trying to hand disrupt their way back into the game against Chien-Pao if you actually do have your pop-offs. So if you actually are going to be the responsible adult and play Bibarrel at the same time, again, don't ask me how you fit it all in, you can make something happen. But that juggle is something that I've done for too long, and at this point I'm just tired of it, and the data tells me it's bad, so I'm going to keep it in that low tier, knowing that it has the potential for pop-offs, and you can lose to this deck quite easily at Worlds for sure, but I think it's not a consistent high tier placer for me.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Miraidon Flaffy. Another very aggressive deck, and I think, again, that's going to be something that is the main benefit of this deck is its aggressive nature and its consistency for a day one setting. I think that's the two main selling points for this kind of archetype in the tournament that we're going into. I think me and Joe had a sort of a brief discussion about this because we've both played a bit of Miraidon Flaffy, and we have a couple of friends who really enjoy the Miraidon decks, so we have like a lot of exposure to it. But we feel like there's the core deck doesn't really have a win condition. It's not really doing anything better than any other deck, other than essentially getting into the game with Miraidon's ability. Outside of that, it doesn't really do anything better than any other deck in terms of trying to win the game. And at that point, you have to choose sort of what lightning package you want to include, whether it's the Regieleki to do more damage against the multi-prize stuff, whether it's the Lost Zone Magnezone stuff, Lost City Magnezone stuff to try and take multiple prizes and win the game that way, whether there's something in the middle, whether you're just playing more consistency cards and trying to just play the game more. All of these different things, there's no, again, similar to the Chien-Pao, we feel like there's no definitive way of doing it, and the more you add, or the more you go down the route of sort of a Magnezone build or a Flaffy build or a Regieleki build, the more you take away from the good parts of Miraidon in that it gets into the game quite quickly and it's quite aggressive. And there just doesn't seem to be a particularly good balance of having a win condition into enough of these archetypes to still be to sort of have or be happy with the fact that you're going to be losing some of the others, as well as still being consistent enough to get into the game. I still think it's going to be popular. Again, the fact that you have built-in VIP passes means that you don't play the roulette that pretty much every other deck does in the top tier other than Arceus. So you don't need to worry too much about that. And again, you're going to be able to pop off here and there with randomly being able to just generate it onto attackers and attack quite quickly. But I think the fact that whether it's the Magnezone stuff or the Path stuff or the Regieleki stuff or the Flaffy stuff or whatever route you go down, all of them seem to compromise, one, the deck's inherent consistency and inherent benefits, +2 some of your other matchups that you're not trying to lean into. I think that really holds the deck back, unfortunately. I don't think it's going to be massively popular. I think it will see quite a low amount of play, and I think it will be people that are quite dedicated to the deck that end up playing it. I don't think it's a particularly sort of hot take for the tournament or anything. I think it will be people that have come to terms or have come to a list that they are happy with, and they know matchups quite well with that list specifically, and maybe it cuts some corners here and there. But I don't think it's a particularly good pick up and play deck, even though it is quite aggressive in terms of getting games done. I still think things like Lugia and Fusion Mew are better in that aspect. So yeah, it's a shame because it's a really, really cool archetype, and it's nice having an archetype that doesn't have to play this sort of battle VIP pass roulette, because you have so many more outs, because you've got Miraidons, you've got any ball search rather than just VIP passes and stuff like that. It's a shame to see that the deck doesn't really have a win condition right now built into it, that you have to start taking aspects from other decks and trying to fit them into this Miraidon shell. And I think that's what's holding it back from really being any better than a C tier deck right now.
All right, let's round it out with a couple of decks. We got Ting-Lu. Definitely a dodge and weave deck. Doesn't seem to be that powerful into Gardevoir, Lugia, Mew. And even any percentage away from Lost Box into Lost Tina is also losing percentage points. So it's worse placed than it was for the NAIC. It did bad at the NAIC. There's not much reason to like Ting-Lu unless you think it's randomly going to be an Arc Fiesta. That's the only thing you capitalize on. And maybe to some extent just regular Lost Box, but it's narrow. It's real narrow. Oh, I guess you're good against Chien-Pao as well. But if you're expecting a ton of that, I don't know what your metagaming is telling you. Yeah, Ting-Lu is just an inconsistent cheese deck compared to Arctina, which is a consistent cheese deck, which is just a far better choice, I think.
Excellent. And finally, United Wings saw obviously some flash in the pan success or popularity post NAIC. A deck that was kind of nowhere, and then all of a sudden everyone was like, oh, it's great. It's not great. It doesn't really like any of this Lost Zone stuff, and the fact that Tina is another Lost Zone deck, even though it's a multi-prize deck, it still plays Sableye, and it turns out that's still a massive issue. So I think the decline in Gardevoir, the rise in Tina, as well as the decline in the expected metagame from Lugia and Fusion Mew, because I think that they were expected to be a little bit more popular at NAIC and were a little bit more popular at NAIC, but didn't do as well, is just not good for the Wings deck. It's a deck that likes to hit the right weaknesses and trade up, and now that we have, in our opinion, the best deck in format is back to a Lost Zone deck, plus there's a second Lost Zone deck in the top tiers, there's just going to be way too much dodging and weaving you have to do. It was quite impressive that it was able to do as well as it did dodging and weaving at NAIC. I think as soon as Alex started hitting Lost Zones, things started to go a little bit wrong for him, and I think that's going to be way more difficult to do in this World Championship tournament. So yeah, it's a shame because it was flash in the pan, and it's a really fun deck to play when you're not playing into Lost Zone, but unfortunately it's just way too much about risk, I think, going for a deck like this.
And Alex didn't even hit Lost Zone the whole time of United Wings and still ended up where he did, so the deck isn't that high a power level anyway, I don't think. Yeah. All right, that rounds out our updated tier list. Honestly, it's not too different from where we were before. We essentially just raised Arc Dura and raised Lost Zone Tina. But outside of that, we were more or less the same. I guess Urshi and Tel as well, a small buff for those, and I guess the Palkia's kind of put back on the map. But yeah, I think it's not too far away from our initial thoughts, but certainly an intriguing sort of study on metagaming, how this Tina's going to show up and show out. I know I was on it really early, essentially like before NAIC we were testing Tina, and it was like among our top decks, and then didn't do well at NAIC, but we carried on with it. And it seems like the masses are behind that mentality now as well. I'm not really sure where that shift has come from, but really strange to think of a deck that wasn't in the top 7 or so of popularity is now in the top 3 of popularity after just one event where it didn't even do well itself. It's such a strange thing to think about. But I was going
to say, I think you've just said it exactly. I think this is the perfect snapshot of if ever you want to explain to someone how a metagame works, this is like the perfect snapshot. This past month or so has been really, really interesting in terms of how things have changed. And like you say, the fact that I think some people have been a bit a bit annoyed that Worlds is the same tournament and Worlds is the same format, and we have like there's two kinds of trains of mindset. There's people that have been annoyed that it's the same format and it should always be a new format. There's people that have been like, oh, we've only had one tournament, so this is going to be really weird to see like what the difference is between this and NAIC. And I think that's a really, really interesting position to be in. I feel like this is one of the biggest meta shifts between tournaments I can remember in my like 10 or 11 years of playing. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether Tina is all bite as well as bark, or whether it's just the online sort of tournaments, I guess, hyping it up. I think there's definitely something there, and I think it's very, very interesting, and a perfect example of how a metagame can shift over a couple of months, especially like even without real like IRL tournaments. It's crazy how the metagame is shifted with essentially nothing happening. It's just like it's almost all talk. And this has happened. So it's going to be really interesting to see whether this actually comes to fruition in a couple of weeks' time.
All right, we'll see you out there in Japan, and thanks so much for watching. We'll be back for another video tomorrow. Cheers.